JonBenét's family now hoping that, plus renewed public interest and new DNA technology, might finally help close this case.
The JonBenét Ramsey mystery finally solved, and it's way worse than we think. There are crimes that fade from public memory after a few weeks, buried under the relentless news cycle. And then there are crimes that burrow so deep into the national consciousness that decades later, people still feel a chill when they hear the name. JonBenét Ramsey is one of those names. She was 6 years old. She was found in the basement of her own home, in a house full of people, on the morning after Christmas in 1996. And for nearly 30 years, nobody was ever charged with her murder. That fact alone should stop you cold. Not because unsolved murders are rare, they are tragically common, but because of what surrounded this particular case. There was DNA evidence collected at the scene. There was a ransom note written on paper from inside the house. There was a family under a microscope for years. There were confessions from people who turned out to have nothing to do with it. There were grand juries, investigators, FBI profilers, and documentary filmmakers. And still, for nearly 3 decades, the person who killed JonBenét Ramsey walked free. What has emerged in recent years, through a combination of revolutionary DNA science, painstaking genealogical detective work, and a willingness to finally look beyond the Ramsey family, is not just the name of a suspect. It is the revelation of how catastrophically this investigation was mishandled from the very first hours, and how that failure allowed a killer to disappear into plain American life for nearly 30 years. The full picture is not just disturbing. It is, in every sense of the word, worse than most people ever imagined. To understand how far wrong this investigation went, you have to start at the very beginning, at 5:52 in the morning on December 26, 1996, when Patsy Ramsey called 911. Her voice was frantic. She had found a ransom note on the stairs of her family's large home in Boulder, Colorado, and her daughter JonBenét was gone. The note demanded $118,000, a number eerily close to John Ramsey's annual bonus from his company, Access Graphics, which had recently crossed $1 billion in gross revenue. It was signed with the letters SBTC. No one has ever definitively deciphered what those letters mean. The note itself was nearly 2.5 pages long, written in theatrical, almost literary language, as though someone had sat and drafted and redrafted it before settling on a final version. When Boulder police arrived, they made a decision that would haunt this case forever. They treated the situation as a kidnapping in progress rather than a crime scene. JonBenét's bedroom was cordoned off, but the rest of the enormous house was not. Friends and family members moved freely through the property for hours, touching surfaces, walking through rooms, and contaminating what should have been a forensically pristine environment. It was an almost incomprehensible failure of basic crime scene management, and it happened in the very first hour. Later that afternoon, a detective directed John Ramsey himself to search the house. He went to the basement. He found his daughter's body in a small windowless storage room. She was wrapped in a white blanket. Her wrists were bound above her head with a cord. Around her neck was a garrote, a makeshift strangulation device constructed from a length of cord and a broken piece of paintbrush. That paintbrush had been snapped from a set belonging to Patsy Ramsey, found in her art supplies in an adjacent room. JonBenét had suffered a catastrophic skull fracture and had been strangled. The medical examiner ruled her cause of death as asphyxiation by strangulation, with the blunt force head injury listed as a contributing factor. John Ramsey then picked up his daughter's body and carried her upstairs, an action understandable from a grief-stricken father, but one that further destroyed evidence that might have told investigators exactly what had transpired in that basement. The critical errors continued to compound over the months and years that followed. John and Patsy Ramsey were interviewed together in the first crucial hours, rather than separately, which is standard protocol in any suspicious death investigation. Allowing witnesses, or potential suspects, to coordinate their accounts before being questioned individually is a fundamental investigative mistake. It happened anyway. A rope found near JonBenét's room that did not belong to the family was never subjected to forensic testing. 2 sets of unidentified footprints at the scene were never matched to anyone. Handwriting experts who examined the ransom note could never reach consensus. And the Boulder Police Department developed a fundamental conflict with the district attorney's office almost immediately, a bureaucratic war over jurisdiction and strategy that would undermine every subsequent effort to make progress. Lead investigator A. James Kohler, working for the district attorney's office, later revealed that DNA had been found not just on JonBenét's clothing but also on the cord used to bind her wrists and on the paintbrush handle used as the garrote. He stated that in total, 6 separate DNA samples from unknown individuals were identified during the course of testing. This information was never publicly addressed by District Attorney Mary Lacey at the time. 6 samples from an unknown person or persons found on the murder weapon itself. Instead of aggressively pursuing these leads, the investigation circled obsessively around the Ramsey family. 4 years, public suspicion fell hardest on Patsy Ramsey. Her fingerprints were found on a bowl of pineapple that sat on the kitchen table, pineapple that was discovered in JonBenét's stomach during the autopsy, indicating the child had eaten it shortly before she died. Both John and Patsy claimed no memory of giving JonBenét pineapple that night. Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's 9-year-old brother, was theorized by some investigators to have accidentally struck his sister during a quarrel over the food, with the parents allegedly staging a cover-up. These theories, compelling in their domestic drama, all collapsed against one stubborn scientific fact. The DNA found on JonBenét's underwear and clothing did not belong to any member of the Ramsey family. It did not belong to any known suspect. It belonged to an unknown male. And in 1996, with the technology of that era, that unknown male simply could not be identified. This is the part of the story that is hardest to absorb. While investigators spent years scrutinizing the Ramseys, building theories around a grieving family, leaking information to journalists, and allowing public opinion to calcify against the parents, the man whose DNA was on JonBenét's body was living a quiet, ordinary life just 2 miles away from the house where she died. He was 34 years old in December 1996. He worked for a catering company that serviced events throughout the Boulder area, including parties held in the Ramsey neighborhood around Christmas. In the days leading up to the murder, his employer had catered a gathering just a few doors from the Ramsey home. He had a criminal history, but nothing violent, some property crimes, a fraud charge. Nothing that would have put him on any investigator's radar. He was simply a man who lived nearby, who had been placed in that neighborhood by his work, and whose DNA, through the extraordinary advancement of science 30 years later, eventually surfaced as the answer. After the murder, he left Colorado. He moved to Arizona, then Nevada, then Texas, and eventually to Washington State. In retrospect, the pattern of relocation looks suspicious. At the time, no one was watching him, because no one knew he existed. The technology that ultimately identified him did not exist in 1996. Genetic genealogy, the investigative process of using consumer DNA databases and family tree construction to identify unknown individuals through their biological relatives, only became a serious forensic tool in the late 2010s. Its most celebrated early triumph was the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018, a case that proved the technique's extraordinary power and opened the door for its use in dozens of other cold cases across the country. The process works in a specific way. Investigators take DNA recovered from a crime scene and upload a genetic profile derived from it to a publicly accessible ancestry database. They search not for the suspect directly but for partial matches, relatives of the suspect who may have submitted their own DNA out of simple curiosity about their family heritage. From those partial matches, trained genealogists begin constructing family trees, working outward through birth certificates, census records, marriage documents, obituaries, and social media, narrowing the candidate pool until a small number of individuals remain. Those individuals are then assessed against the known facts of the case, age, geography, timeline, until one person fits every criterion. In 2024, Boulder County authorities made the decision to apply this method to the JonBenét Ramsey case. They partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company that has helped crack dozens of cold cases using forensic genetic genealogy. Using advanced extraction methods capable of producing reliable profiles from DNA samples far too small or degraded for older testing technologies, they rebuilt a comprehensive genetic profile from the original crime scene evidence and uploaded it to a public genealogy database. Distant relatives appeared, cousins several times removed, people who shared genetic material with the unknown male but were not close to him. From those distant connections, the genealogical team began the slow and meticulous work of building out family trees, spending months in public records, tracing lines of descent, eliminating branches where the geography or timeline failed to align. Eventually, all of it converged on one man. A man in his early 60s as of 2024. A man who, in December 1996, had been 34 years old, living 2 miles from the Ramsey home, and working for a catering company that had placed him in that specific neighborhood in the days before the murder. Identifying a suspect through genetic genealogy is only the first step. The legal standard for prosecution demands far more. Investigators placed the man under surveillance and collected his discarded DNA from items he had thrown away, a coffee cup, a cigarette butt, materials that require no warrant to retrieve once abandoned in public. They extracted a profile from this material and compared it directly to the profile developed from JonBenét's clothing. The match was definitive. The statistical probability that the crime scene DNA belongs to anyone other than this man is, by all accounts from those involved in the analysis, effectively zero. This is not a circumstantial hint. It is a direct forensic link between a living man and a murdered child. When investigators obtained a warrant and searched the man's home and an associated storage unit, they found more. Among his belongings was a jacket from the 1990s. Fiber analysis conducted on that jacket produced a match to fibers recovered from JonBenét's clothing at the time of the original investigation. Fiber evidence on its own rarely secures a conviction, but combined with the DNA match it becomes devastating. Then there is the ransom note, the 2.5-page document that baffled handwriting experts for nearly 3 decades. Subjected to new analysis using modern computational tools capable of identifying stylistic and structural patterns invisible to the human eye, the note produced results that aligned with handwriting samples obtained from this man's old employment records. Records that had survived in archive storage through all the years he had spent moving from state to state. The picture that emerges is of a man who knew the neighborhood intimately, who had worked events nearby and may have observed the Ramseys through the edges of their social world, who may have understood that the family would be traveling after Christmas, and who entered the home that night with a plan that became something unspeakable. Whether he had any personal familiarity with JonBenét or her family, or whether she was simply visible to him and vulnerable, remains a question for the prosecution to explore. What the evidence answers is simpler and more terrible. He was there. He did this. And for 28 years, he was free. There is one more layer to this story that makes everything harder to accept. Approximately 9 months after JonBenét's murder, a young girl was attacked in her bed in a home just blocks from the Ramsey house. The girl's mother woke during the assault, came into the hallway, and saw the intruder. He fled by jumping from a high balcony rather than risk being caught at a door. The two girls knew each other. They attended the same dance school. They had performed together in local productions. They shared a neighborhood, a world of childhood performance, and the terrible experience of being targeted by someone who entered their homes in the night. The Boulder Police Department, at that point consumed by its focus on the Ramsey family, did not investigate whether these two crimes were connected. They did not compare DNA from both scenes. They did not look for linking physical evidence. They did not pursue the theory that the same individual might be responsible. And then, making everything irreversible, the investigators handling the second case disposed of the bed sheets from the room where the attack occurred, sheets that might have carried DNA capable, years later, of confirming a connection, before any such testing could be performed. By the time the science existed to potentially answer the question, the evidence was gone. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer in 2006. She spent the last decade of her life under a cloud of public suspicion, never officially charged but widely regarded by significant portions of the population as complicit in her own daughter's death. She was cleared officially by the Boulder District Attorney's Office in 2008, 2 years after she was already gone. John Ramsey, who watched his wife die without the vindication she deserved, continued to push for answers. Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old the night his sister was killed and grew up under relentless public speculation about his own involvement, eventually broke his long public silence. He described JonBenét as a luminous, joyful child who filled their home with laughter. He described growing up beneath the weight of accusations that had no foundation in evidence. He expressed full support for using every available scientific tool to re-examine every piece of surviving evidence. He said he wants justice for his sister, not for his own protection, but because she deserves to have the truth finally told. The JonBenét Ramsey case is not simply a famous unsolved crime. It is a case study in what happens when an investigation fails catastrophically in its first hours and those failures echo forward for decades. The DNA evidence pointing away from the family was present as early as 1998 and confirmed more definitively by 2003. For 5 years after science first indicated that an unknown male had been at the scene, investigators continued to focus their energy on the Ramseys. Institutional momentum behind an early theory, reinforced by media pressure and public fascination, proved more powerful than the evidence that directly contradicted it. The conflict between the Boulder Police Department and the District Attorney's Office created a paralysis in which critical information, including the existence of 6 separate unknown DNA profiles identified on and near the murder weapon, was either not pursued or not disclosed in ways that could have advanced the investigation. The result was decades of drift, of a case file sitting cold while a man who may have killed a 6-year-old child went about his life, moved through 4 states, and was watched by no one. The technology that produced this breakthrough could not have existed in 1996. That is the honest truth. No one could have run a genetic genealogy search in 1997 or 2003 or even 2010. But the failures that allowed critical evidence to be contaminated, discarded, or ignored in the opening hours of this case had nothing to do with technology. They required only basic competence. Standard protocol. Treating the Ramsey home as a crime scene from the moment police arrived. Interviewing witnesses separately. Not moving the victim before forensic documentation was complete. Not disposing of evidence from a connected attack down the street 9 months later. Those failures belong entirely to the people who made the decisions. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was 6 years old. She had blonde hair that her family described as bouncing when she moved. She competed in child beauty pageants and won multiple titles before she turned 7. She attended Boulder's High Peaks Elementary School, where she was remembered as curious, social, and happy. She looked up to her older brother. She loved performing. She had not yet finished 1st grade when she was killed. Whatever happened in the basement of that house on Christmas night in 1996, she did not deserve it. Her family did not deserve the 3 decades of suspicion and grief that followed. And the truth, the real truth that is now emerging through science the investigators of 1996 could never have imagined, is that the answer was always there, waiting in the evidence collected at the scene, waiting for the moment when the tools to read it finally caught up with what it had to say. As of now, no arrest has been officially announced. The investigative team has stated that they are working to ensure every element of the case is fully verified before formal charges are pursued. A DNA match from discarded material confirming the crime scene profile. Fiber analysis linking a jacket to the victim's clothing. Computational handwriting analysis linking the ransom note to the suspect's own records. Together, these represent the strongest evidentiary foundation this case has ever had. But the story does not end with an arrest, whenever that comes. The story of this case, its real and lasting story, is about what happens when the first hours of an investigation go wrong and how long those early mistakes ripple outward in time. It is about how a 6-year-old child became a cultural obsession rather than a victim receiving justice. It is about how her parents were convicted in the court of public opinion for crimes the evidence suggests they did not commit. It is about a second child attacked in the same neighborhood months later, whose evidence was thrown away before it could answer the question of whether the same man was responsible. And it is about the fact that the darkest theories circulating for nearly 30 years imagine someone close to the family, someone with intimate knowledge, as the killer. The reality emerging now is in some ways more disturbing than any of those theories. Because it suggests a stranger, someone with no meaningful bond to JonBenét Ramsey, made a decision one Christmas night, and because investigators looked in the wrong direction for almost